I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler.
What these men stand for, we will patiently and temporarily discover.
There is a country that today might seem like a small dot on the map, Lithuania. A quiet Baltic nation sandwiched between giants. But history has a weak sense of irony. Because once this little country was enormous. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, 15th century, the largest country in Europe. It stretched from the Baltic Sea almost to the Black Sea, a sprawling multicultural empire that spoke in many tongues, prayed in many ways, and survived on the knife's edge of diplomacy and war. They were the last pagans in Europe to convert, the last to bow to Rome. And for centuries, Lithuania absorbed the blows of history, Mongols, Teutonic Knights, Muscovites, until finally, with Poland, it forged the Commonwealth. One of the boldest political experiments of its age. But nothing gold can stay. By the end of 18th century, it was all gone. Russia, Prussia, Austria carved the Commonwealth apart like a carcass on the table. And for over 100 years, Lithuania vanished into the Russian Empire. Its language banned, its culture suppressed, even its name erased. And yet, somehow, the flame survived. Smuggled books, secret schools, a stubborn national will. Until 1918, when in the chaos of World War I and the Russian Revolution, Lithuania dared to declare itself free again. Not everyone liked that. Soviets attacked from the east, Poles from the south, treaties shifted, armies marched, but by the early 1920s, Lithuania was standing. Not unscathed, not complete. Vilnius was lost to Poland, but standing. Its capital moved to Kaunas, so-called a temporary capital that would become a stage for one of the strangest and most extraordinary stories of the Second World War. By the 1930s, Antanas Smetona ruled as an authoritarian. Lithuania's position caught between wolves. Hitler's Germany on one side, Stalin's Soviet Union on the other. Neutrality wasn't choice, it was survival. But neutrality is a lie. And in September 1939, that lie collapsed. Germany invited Poland from the west. 2 weeks later, the Soviets struck from the east. Poland, that old Commonwealth partner, was torn apart again. And suddenly, Lithuania's borders were flooded. Soldiers, families, Jewish refugees, thousands upon thousands pouring into a country that had no resources, no plan, and no time. They were running from death. Some didn't know it yet, but they had only months left to live. And Kaunas, this little city, this temporary capital, became a vortex. A nest of diplomats and spies, underground networks, and forged papers, desperation and courage. It's here we'll meet Chuine Sugihara, the Japanese consul who wrote visas until his hand literally cramped, and Jan Zwartendijk, the Dutchman who invented an escape route out of a thin air. But before we meet them, we need to understand what kind of world they were operating in. And for that, we go back to July 1938, to a French lakeside resort, to the Evian Conference. It's the summer before the war. Hitler has already stripped Jews of citizenship, dignity, rights. The Anschluss has just added 200,000 Austrian Jews to the Nazi target list. Synagogues are being vandalized. passports marked with a red J. These people, families, scholars, workers, doctors, suddenly have no country, no protection. And so, 32 nations gathered at Evian les Bains. The world is watching. The question is simple. Will anyone help? The answer? No. Not shouted, not declared with fists on tables, but whispered politely in diplomatic tones. One by one, the delegates stand up and explain why they can do nothing. Evian wasn't a search for solutions. It was, as one historian put it, a ritual of abdication. The language of diplomacy is deceptive, polished, remote, full of phrases like regrettably unable and deeply sympathetic. But strip away the varnish and you'll hear the truth. Every explanation was a refusal. Every refusal was delayed death sentence. The world didn't stumble into Evian unprepared. No. The doors were already closing. Switzerland had begun fortifying its borders right after the Anschluss. France issued new restrictions on Jewish refugees. The Netherlands flatly declared that forced migrants were unwelcome. Even Poland, with over 3 million Jews of its own, revoked the passports of those abroad, making them stateless. By mid-1938, the world wasn't standing by. It was actively shutting escape routes. Even Evian just made it official. And inside the conference halls, fear. No, not of Hitler, not of anti-Semitism, fear of responsibility. Australia said, quote, "We don't want to import a racial problem." Canada's delegates summed up its position in 3 chilling words, quote, "None is too many." Britain worried about Palestine. The United States, the host of the conference, made it clear that immigration quotas would not change. Over and over, reasons, excuses, polite indifference. There were gestures, of course, new committees, promises of further study, but no teeth, no quotas, no action. Except one country, the Dominican Republic. Dictator Rafael Trujillo offered to take 100,000 Jews, not out of compassion, but to widen its population. In reality, only 640 ever made it there. Even the rare exceptions were poisoned by self-interest. And perhaps the cruelest stroke of all, in the final resolution, a clause about allowing refugees to keep their property was removed. Why? Because Germany demanded it. And without property, refugees became not citizens, but liabilities. Human beings turned into burdens. This bureaucratic erasure was the true soul of Evian. Because when you erase a person's right to own, you erase the right to belong. And yet, in the hall, one voice cut through the fog. Colombia's delegate, Jesus Maria Ips, he didn't name Germany or Jews directly, but he asked the question no one else dared. Could a state strip its citizens of rights and turn them into a stateless people? Was this not the opening of a policy of evil? He warned. Unless the root was destroyed, more victims will come. He called Evian a modern-day wailing wall, a place of mourning, not action. Most delegates ignored him. 4 months later, came Kristallnacht. Synagogues in flames, businesses shattered, Jews beaten and arrested. Proof, if proof was still needed, that Evian had failed before it even began. The conference ended in polite applause, in handshakes, in promises, but the world had chosen committees over people. As one historian put it, quote, "The world was founding organizations so it wouldn't have to open borders." Let's linger a little long in Evian-les-Bains. Imagine walking its quiet streets in July 1938. Lake Geneva, glistening in the sun, delegates clinking wine glasses, polite smiles for the cameras. The shadow of 32 nations gathered under the banner of solutions. But make no mistake, this wasn't an emergency summit. It wasn't about immediate rescue. This was a pageant, a rehearsal of excuses. Once I wrote a book about these events, and I will quote myself. Delegates agreed on almost nothing, except one thing. They would not be the ones to open the door. End of quote. Every delegate brought a speech polished like fine silver, every word wrapped into the velvet of caution. And yet, peel back the layers and you will find the same thing: refusal. Britain avoided the subject of Jewish immigration to Palestine, terrified of Arab backlash. The United States clung to its quotas, hiding behind bureaucracy. Roosevelt didn't even come in person. He sent delegates, and with them the message: sympathy, but no change. Again, from my research, quote, "The whole atmosphere of Evian was marked by cautious solidarity of inaction." That was the rhythm of Evian, a careful dance, a choreography of closed doors. I will quote again myself. It was less a conference than a relay race, passing the burden from one state to another. And the baton in this race wasn't paper. It wasn't policy. It was human lives. There had even been a small clause in the draft resolution about letting refugees keep their personal property, just their savings, just enough dignity to start over. But Germany objected, as we said before, and the clause was erased. The deletion was more than symbolic, because most governments would only accept refugees who could support themselves. If you had no money, you were welcome. If you had money, you were welcome. If you had nothing, you were a liability. Germany has stripped the Jews of everything, and the world, in response, shrugged. One European official said it bluntly, quote, "No money, no entry," end of quote. Evian wasn't just about borders, it was about values, about the idea that a life's worth could be measured in currency, in labor, in assimilability. This wasn't Nazi ideology. This was global pragmatism dressed in diplomatic robes. And in Berlin, the message landed like a gift. The Nazis were watching, and they understood no one was coming to stop them. When Evian Conference ended, the delegates shook hands, smiled for the cameras, issued a communique filled with a deep concern and sincere hope for cooperation. And then they went home, back to London, Paris, Washington, Buenos Aires. The refugees? They stayed, still in Vienna, still in Berlin, still standing in line outside the consulates, clutching papers that now meant almost nothing. Back in Kaunas, the Jewish press called Evian by its real name, the Conference of Excuses. Across Europe, the borders of exclusion had hardened. Switzerland didn't prepare for tanks, it prepared for refugees. Days after Anschluss, new patrols appeared at the Austrian border. Barbed wire went up. Checkpoints stiffened. By summer, Switzerland and France had fortified their frontiers. Not to stop Hitler, to stop Jews. And when Austrian Jews suddenly became Germans, the Swiss were faced with a problem. They no longer needed permits to cross. The solution? Bureaucratic alchemy. A new stamp, a scarlet letter, a red J burned into Jewish passports. Not for identification, for rejection. Now, guards could turn Jews away legally. France followed. Prime Minister Edouard Daladier signed a decree dividing refugees into two categories: the deserving ones, Russians, Armenians from the earlier wave, and the undeserving ones, Jews fleeing from Austria. One French official told a relief worker without shame, quote, "We cannot be expected to shelter the refuse of another nation's upheaval." End of quote. Men, women, children labeled as refuse. And Europe knew exactly what was coming. Dr. Leo Lauterbach of the World Zionist Organization visited Vienna in spring 1938. He told the League of Nations that Nazi policy was shifting into economic strangulation, a quiet bureaucratic starvation. By April, his warning had numbers to back it. The New York Times reported suicide rates among Vienna's Jews climbing by the day. By month's end, more than 2,000 had taken their own lives. Not murdered outright, but driven to despair. And it wasn't just Western Europe. Poland passed a law forcing Jews abroad to return home by October 1938 or lose their passports entirely. Tens of thousands, suddenly stateless, denied the right to come back. Meanwhile, anti-Jewish riots exploded in Warsaw. Windows smashed, people beaten in the streets, crowds chanting, "Jews to Madagascar!" Even the Netherlands, that supposed refugees, slammed the door. No more forced migrants. The delegate at Evian admitted they already taken 24,000. That was enough. And the colonies? Suriname, Curacao, utterly unsuitable for European life. Throwaway line. But in 2 years, that same unsuitable colony, Curacao, would become the improbable salvation stamped in Kaunas by a Dutch diplomat named Jan Zwartendijk. For now, though, in 1938, the message was the same across the map. Germany pushes Jews out. The world looks away. So what did Evian accomplish? It created a committee, the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, based in London, chaired by George Robley, a friend of Roosevelt. It had no funding, no teeth, no mandate. A British diplomat summed it up: a gesture of concern, nothing more. And all the while, the refugees kept fleeing from Germany, from Austria, soon from Czechoslovakia. And everywhere they turned. Closed passports, sealed borders, cold stares at checkpoints. Some argue that the world was simply unprepared, that the Great Depression had wrecked economies, that leaders were paralyzed by fear of communism, fascism, revolt. But that argument doesn't hold, because the world knew. They had their reports, they had the numbers, they had the testimonies. This wasn't failure of knowledge, it was failure of will. Once I wrote, what happened in Evian was a failure not of knowledge, but of empathy. By August 1938, Evian was over. The delegates had gone home, and for the Jews of Germany and Austria, nothing had changed. In fact, things got worse. For Hitler, Evian wasn't a warning, it was a confirmation. He told his inner circle, "If the world doesn't want them, I will gladly let them go." Evian didn't deter him, it emboldened him. The message was simple. The great democracies of the world, wealthy, free, powerful, would talk about refugees. They would sympathize, but they would not take them. Diplomatic cables from London congratulated themselves. Britain had avoided commitments. Washington patted itself on the back for hosting the conference at all. The press called it an effort of goodwill. But Jewish newspapers told the truth. One in Kaunas ran the headline, "Evian, the conference that failed before it began." They were right. Evian, even the final resolution, vague, watered down, sterile, had been gutted. That one clause protecting refugees' right to keep their property gone erased Germany's demands. And that mattered, because a refugee with assets was at least useful. Without property, they were nothing but a burden, a liability, and for governments deciding whether to admit them, that sealed it. The doors stayed shut. And then the storm broke. August brought new restrictions. Jews banned from more professions. Jewish children pushed out of schools. Synagogues vandalized openly in Vienna. And then November 9th, the Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Across Germany and Austria, synagogues went up in flames. Businesses smashed, homes destroyed. Over 250 synagogues burned. 91 Jews murdered. 30,000 more arrested and marched off to camps Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. It was no longer about pushing Jews out, it was about terror. And the world? Outrage in the headlines, shock in the editorials, but policy unchanged. Quotas stayed, borders closed. Yes, Britain created a kinder passport saving thousands of children. But the parents, their brothers, their sisters left behind, still unwanted, still trapped. Evian was already fading from memory, but its shadow had only grown darker. Look again in the map of Europe in 1938, not the map of borders, the map of morality. Evian revealed it. Borders drawn not just around land, but around responsibility. Each country saying the same thing, not here, not us, not now. And so Jews of Austria, Germany, Czechoslovakia turned to the margins, places ignored by the great powers. Lithuania, Latvia, Shanghai, Curacao, not destinations of welcome, destinations of possibility. Cracks in the wall, a loophole, a stamp, a single line of the ink that could mean the difference between life and death. In this landscape of failure, strange things happened. Small players matter. Kaunas, a temporary capital, became a crossroads of fate. Refugees arrived in trickles, clutching what little they had. And what they needed most was paper, passports, visas, transit documents. And so a handful of men, a Japanese, Dutch, Polish, Lithuanian, became gatekeepers of survival. One of them, Jan Zwartendijk, the Dutch honorary consul, a man hardly mentioned in any official record. But in 1940, he would begin writing one line in passports over and over. No visa is required for entry to Curacao. Just that. A simple sentence. But it cracked open the wall. Because if Curacao required no visa, and if Japan would issue a transit visa together, then suddenly a path appeared, a way out. Evian had shown the world what not to do, and in Kaunas, a few people decided they would not wait for orders. They would not ask permission. They would act. While 32 nations hid behind procedure, Svartendik and Sugihara built a pipeline to survival. Their consulates became sanctuaries. Their pens became weapons. And each stroke of ink was an act of defiance. Because after Evian, silence was no longer neutral. It was complicity. So what do we make of Evian? Historians still argue. Some say it was sincere but crippled by economics and politics. Others call it what it was, a charade. A theater of empathy designed not to solve the crisis, but to bury it. Some go further still. Evian wasn't a rebuke to Hitler. It was a green light, a subtle message. Do what you want with your Jews. We will not interfere. But strip away the politics and there is something simpler. Evian shows the deadly comfort of delay. The phrase that kills more than any bullet. Not yet. Because every nation has its reasons, its quotas, its concerns, but none had the courage to say, we'll act anyway. And in that silence, evil thrived. I will quote again myself. The main thing is not to keep silent. There can be no single truth or interpretation of Evian, but there must be dialogue. It's tempting to say no one could have known, but they did. The toothbrushes scrubbing Vienna Street, the passports stamped with a red J, the reports of suicides in Vienna, the fires of Kristallnacht, they all saw and choose to look away. So why remember Evian? Because history doesn't vanish, it echoes. Every time nations debate who deserves asylum, every time leaders claim their country is full, every time a border is sealed against people fleeing death, Evian whispers. Evian is not only about what was lost, it's about what was almost saved, the lives that could have been lived, the books unwritten, the music unheard, the generations unborn, because 32 nations applauded themselves while turning their backs. So we remember, not to wallow in guilt, but to recognize responsibility, not to condemn the past, but to guide the present. Evian was not inevitable, it was chosen. And if it was chosen, then so is everything that comes after. Next time, we'll leave Evian behind. We return to Kaunas, to a Japanese consul named Sugihara, to a Dutch consul named Zwartendik, to a handful of men who refused to repeat Evian's silence. Because if Evian was the stage of excuses, Kaunas would become the theater of quiet resistance. You've been listening to Shadows in History, the first episode, Transit Zone. Stay with us, because the next chapter begins. What the world wants.